Back in the days of empire, the British started to grow concerned about the number of cobras in the province of India. And the governors came up with a fairly simple economic remedy for this. Why don't we just offer a bounty for cobra hides? And that policy was a hit. It was so successful, in fact, that enterprising Indians started to breed cobras just to get the bounty. Unsurprisingly, this then caused a suspicious uptick in the number of bounties paid out. Eventually, the Brits actually clocked on and realized what was happening and cancelled that scheme. But this posed a problem to the breeders, right? They now had all these worthless snakes. What are they going to do with them? And they chose to loose the surplus serpents, and that caused the wild cobra population to surge past its previous levels, completely defeating the point of the program. Almost every action we take introduces the risk of unintended consequences. Technology, of course, is no different. And this is something that the cultural theorist Paul Virilio knew very well. In his famous words, "When you invent the ship, you also invent the shipwreck." Every technology carries its own negativity, which is invented at the same time as technical progress. And oh boy, have we discovered these negativities. We've served up countless examples of technology gone wrong. The press, particularly, is now as likely to call technology a danger as much as a savior. Now, to be clear, these mistakes here, they were not intentional. They're mostly the result of these unintended consequences. But that doesn't mean we escape blame. Although there may not have been malice involved, these mistakes were the result of ethical negligence. And I think unless this changes, it's going to significantly harm the growth of our field. Over the next 10 to 20 years, the tech industry is going to demand an enormous amount of trust from its users. We'll ask people to connect more and more of their lives to the products and the services that we build. We'll ask them to trust us with their homes, with their vehicles, even the safety of their families. So the potential harms implicit within emerging technology exceed even those harms we see today. The stakes will only get higher with time. Algorithms could reinforce and cement bias in access to work and amenities and even justice. Thirsty data centers and aggressive upgrade cycles could contribute significantly to climate change. Surveillance systems could silently assemble the building blocks of authoritarianism. Autonomous machines could be weaponized, putting death-dealing power in the hands of tiny groups. Automation could ravage the world of work, deepening inequality and upending our economies. And of course, any advanced artificial intelligence could force us to redefine what it means to be a human. So it's time for our industry to take its ethical responsibilities seriously. This has been my focus now for the last 2 or 3 years. So I'd like to talk a bit about what I've learned along this journey, and perhaps more importantly, what we as a community of designers and manufacturers and practitioners, and how can we respond to these challenges. Perhaps one of the most fundamental shifts that we have to acknowledge in our mindsets is that technology is never neutral, and it never was either. Back in 1980, the philosopher Langdon Winner wrote a now famous essay called "Do Artifacts Have Politics?" His conclusion was, yeah, damn right they do. And he gave the example of Robert Moses. Robert Moses was, as some of you may know, was the main city planner of New York back in the middle of the last century. And Moses was a racist. We now have ample evidence of his bigoted views. And Winner goes on to assert that actually Moses used the design of the city, of the urban infrastructure, to enforce his own prejudice upon the urban environment. A lot of them by using bridges, actually. Bridges such as this one over the freeways, the parkways leading to the beaches of Long Island. The idea being that these bridges were built so intentionally low that buses couldn't get underneath them. And minorities, and particularly black residents of the New York area, tended to have less access to private transport. They tended to travel more often by bus, and as such, they were denied access to certain parts of the city thanks to these hulking great big structures of stone and steel and concrete. So if something as inert as a bridge can have an ethical and a social and a political impact, then of course our contemporary technologies can as well, being full of language and light and energy. It's a mistake, therefore, I think, to separate technical capabilities from human capabilities. These things act together. We become interwoven. We are hybrid actors in that space. Things change what people can do. They change how we see the world and what we can do with that world. It is perhaps true to an extent that guns don't kill people, but a gunman, a hybrid actor of a human and technology coming together, sure as hell can. So we have to abandon this idea that the things we build are just neutral tools. We have to recognize we can't just wash our hands of the social and political and ethical implications of our work. Now, to some, this is a bit of a tough sell because technology and algorithms and data, the things that fuel technologies, can be seen to a lot of people as clean, objective, neutral things. The ideology behind a lot of technology is, ironically, that technology has no ideology. And of course, we know that that's not the case. Professor Jeffrey Bowker coined this memorable phrase, raw data is an oxymoron. All algorithms, all data carries the biases of the people and the cultures that create, process, collect, and present that data. Here you see this is a fantastic piece of information design by Simon Scar for the South China Morning Post, talking about the Iraq conflict. And he's using a very clear metaphor, frankly a quite biasing metaphor, of dripping blood to talk about the heavy human cost of this conflict. I think this is a great piece of information design. On the right-hand side, however, we see Andrew Cotgrave, who works at Tableau Software, completely transforming the meaning and the connotation of the exact same raw data, the same numbers, the same figures, being represented to say a completely different thing, with just 3 changes. He simply changes the headline, he changes the hue of the graph, and he inverts the diagram on the vertical axis there. The idea that this raw data stays the same and it tells the same story regardless of context is clearly, I think, shown to be a myth. Another mental shift we have to make is to recognize that actually design is the application of ethics. Now, sometimes that relationship is explicit. If you're designing razor wire, then whether you realize it or not, you're making a clear statement that someone's right to private property is so important that we should injure other people who choose to contravene that right. But even if you're not making something as morally implicated as razor wire or weapons, all design, and for that matter, all manufacture, is a statement about the future. When we design, we make claims about how we should interact with technology and, by extension, how we should interact with each other. And at the same time, we're discarding hundreds, thousands of other futures, of alternative timelines. So there's a clear ethical component within that when we are making a statement about how we should all live in future. In an ideal world, we don't want to consider ethics as something separate from the way that we build. We want to consider it an ethos, a perspective, an approach that we bring to our work and the entire world around us. But we do, of course, have to start somewhere. And although I'm wary of the idea of saying ethics can be injected into the design process, it is clear that there are particular points of leverage, particular points of influence that we can start to have these conversations within our teams. So forgive my oversimplification here of the design process. Of course, we all know that things are really rather messier. But we can begin right at the start of the project when we're defining what it is we want to work on, understanding our users and defining the success criteria for our project. One thing that's, I think, particularly important is to widen our perspective on who we think of as a stakeholder for our work. Now, if you open any MBA textbook and look up stakeholder analysis section, which will certainly be there, mostly they will talk about a stakeholder being someone who can affect the project. And usually this is your peers, your colleagues in industry, often people wearing suits or someone like that who can come along and change the parameters of what you're working on. But there is a second group of stakeholders that we often overlook, and that's people who can be affected by the project. And too often we've ignored these people or we've not paid them due attention. If we look at something like Airbnb, for example, that's a fantastically well-designed service for precisely 2 groups of people. The first being people who have spare property, and then the second being people who want to rent a room or property, usually in a different city. So under the parameters of user-centered design, that serves that need very well. Unfortunately, of course, all the costs, the externalities of that system fall not on those groups, but on the local neighborhoods. If you live next door to an Airbnb, then you no longer have a neighbor. You have a new set of neighbors. Every couple of days, all of them dragging those damned wheelie suitcases over the cobbles at 5 a.m. in the morning. They're not going to spend their money locally. They'll spend it in the tourist traps. They're not going to be interested in building a community or conforming to the norms and expectations of your neighborhood. They'll behave by their own rules. So partly, I think user-centered design has actually given us an individualistic and overly narrow focus. We focus so much on user needs that we've neglected to consider the needs of broader society. If, say, you work for Facebook, then there's actually a case that your work may be fulfilling those user-centric needs, but has generally failed society's needs. We could even say that abstract nouns, qualities like the freedom of the press or democracy, values and concepts that we want to preserve, that we think are valuable to modern life, those can even be harmed by some of the decisions that we take as technologists. Maybe it's time to explicitly label those things as stakeholders within the design process. Something else we might do is to use what I call a persona non grata. This is essentially, it's a bit like a dark persona. It's a persona noir. It's someone who we give the full persona treatment to. We'll give them a name and a face, and we'll put them up in the office walls and all that sort of thing. But these are bad actors within the system. These are people, maybe they're hackers or trolls or terrorists or someone like that, who want to use the systems we build for the purposes of harming other people. And of course, our job then as designers and developers becomes to obstruct these people, comes to hamper everything that they want to achieve. By shining light on their motivations and their activities, the idea is then that we can start to confront those head on. When we come to the idea generation phase, I think we have two particularly important strategies. When we talk about unintended consequences, it's important to make a distinction here, if you like. Unforeseeable consequences are not the same as unintended consequences. There are potentially foreseeable errors that we're about to make in our work that we tend to overlook or ignore because we haven't taken the time to give them foresight. So we can actually try to tease out the second order and third order impacts of our work. If you talk to ethicists about this question, they sometimes talk about moral imagination, the idea of trying to anticipate what's going to happen next, and then thinking about the moral implications and the impact on various people. But that's quite an abstract concept, right? I mean, it's a thought experiment. I found it's easier to do this if you have some kind of prompt. So I like to borrow from speculative design, create what I call a provocatype. You might also call it a design fiction. Those terms probably overlap as well. But this is easiest if illustrated with an example. It's probably an example that some of you in this room know quite well. This is by Marcel and Harm, of course. They're provocatype, as I would call it, for an electric vehicle charging station. And the scenario was essentially the intersection, as I understand it, of a scarce energy future and public charging infrastructure for electric vehicles. Sort of makes sense. It's pretty unlikely that each home is going to have their own, great big charging panel. There's going to be some kind of shared public, potentially, infrastructure there. And so the question becomes, how does a system like this allocate energy resources in this potentially scarce environment? And the way it works is this. I've been lucky enough to see this in person. It comes with the charging cables, right? So you pick them up and plug them in. The LEDs light up to show which color you are, what your color code has been allocated in the system. You then authenticate with an RFID card and use the dials above to make requests of the system. Well, I want a short burst of energy. I need it now, but just a little bit, and then I'll be on my way. Or I need a full charge, but yeah, I'm happy to wait. That's going to be an overnight thing or whatever it is. And then, of course, the system, the algorithm, has to handle these competing requests for energy. And so above this, essentially, I think, is the output, I would say. The conclusion the algorithm has come to about, well, who's going to get how much energy at certain times. So we're starting at the bottom, and then as time goes up, you'll see that the energy bandwidth, if you like, gets wider and smaller, depending on our predicted availability of energy. But then we see also the allocation of energy. The moment red and blue are having a little bit, then blue takes over, and then it will be green's turn overnight or whatever that might be. So this essentially shows the priority, the queue, the results of the algorithmic decision. So I think this is a very interesting provocation into what an algorithmically driven world might look like in perhaps a decade or two. But what really excited me about this particular piece of work was that they didn't stop there, right? They created the RFID cards as well. That's part of the design fiction of the provocatype. So people are issued with cards that allocate energy status or social status within this wider system. So if you're a doctor, you see the one in the middle there, you have top priority, but that comes with a legal caveat, or a threat essentially, used with discretion. Unauthorized use is punishable by law. Underneath that, there's a probation ID. Presumably this is something we'd give to maybe a recent offender or someone awaiting trial or whatever it is. Their energy use is capped. They have low priority within the system. So we see here how social status and potential inequality could be encoded and reinforced with the Internet of Things and energy scarcity and the collision of those two things. Now, I'm fairly sure that Marcel and Harm aren't saying this is the correct solution, right? They're not saying, well, just go and ship this right now. But it's the design that gets the right conversations happening. It's an artifact around which we can congregate and get that moral imagination exercise, start to really tease out what are the implications of this type of work. For me, this design fiction, this provocatype, is an artifact that creates a strange wormhole between design and research. It's a designed object, but it's mostly there as a probe to tease out other ideas and bring them to the surface so that we can have a more fully realized discussion around them. I also think we have to reframe the way we consider ethics within our companies. Far too often, ethics can be seen as a drag, right? It's something that will slow down innovation, that will get in the way of our beloved progress, if you like. But I like the phrasing from Peter Paul Verbeek, who's at the University of Twente. He says that ethics should accompany technology. It doesn't have to necessarily directly oppose it. So we should find ways to infuse ethics into our work. For me, probably the best framing is to think of ethics as a constraint. Now, designers know the power of constraints. Design doesn't exist without constraints. And we know that constraints don't actually reduce the number of possibilities. Well, they may reduce some of them, right? They'll take a couple off the table, but they will introduce new ones. They'll provide essentially a seed for innovation, not just a pair of shears. When we come to what we might call the design phase proper, we have an opportunity to address what I think is one of the most fundamental ethical challenges of digital technology. So many of the problems with today's technology come from some kind of invisibility. Under the mantras of simplicity, we've treated things like data flows as complexity. Designers have said, we've trained users that they really have no business exploring the data flows within the system. We've hidden things under the hood and said, it's fine, you don't need to worry about that. But as I say, this, whether it's intentional or otherwise, this invisibility causes people to lose agency within that system. They don't fully understand what's happening within it. Now, sometimes people talk about, well, what we need then is transparency around, say, data flows. But for me, that's actually completely the wrong framing. Something that's transparent is something that you can't see. It's something you see through. Instead, I think we should talk about materializing the things that were previously invisible, shifting them into the visible spectrum, be they data flows or algorithmic persuasion, so that people can make more informed choices about what's happening inside their technologies. Probably the best example in modern consumer products of this kind of thing is the energy monitor in hybrid vehicles. This is from the Prius, as I'm sure many of you know. What I love about this design, it's got an old version now, but it gives insight into something that was previously invisible. It's a very abstract concept of how energy is flowing throughout your vehicle. But by doing so, by bringing that front and center to the driver's attention, the driver can then adapt his or her style and say, okay, well, I know now when I accelerate sharply away from lights that I actually draw from the energy from the motor rather than from the battery, and that's going to be a less ecologically sound choice. So people can change their interactions with technology because we've materialized those flows that were previously hidden. We might, for instance, look to create something similar for data flows within a system. Let's say we have some kind of home hub device a sort of slightly echoey, nesty sort of thing that's connecting the smart home, but then maybe has access to biometrics on your wearables as well. And let's hypothesize that you're given this device for free in exchange for seeing some adverts, right? Maybe that's the business model at hand here. And attempted to try to materialize the data flows within that system, I think is a potentially valuable way to change the relationships here. Too often, the data flows have been hidden, and that's caused an imbalance of power. But if we're clear about exactly how data is moving through this complex system, I think we get closer to genuinely informed consent. The user now knows what's happening, and importantly, they've got an opportunity to correct it. They might say, actually, you know what, I don't think you deserve access to my heart rate, right? So I'll tap this and remove it. So this allows, I think, for a much fairer data exchange than we currently have with a lot of today's technologies. Another design tenet that we often hear comes from Steve Krug, the idea that we shouldn't make the user think. And of course, as a designer, I know that's often true. You generally want to reduce friction in interfaces. But again, it can cause agency and autonomy to be removed from the user. It gives us the ability to sort of say, well, don't worry about that, we've got it covered. Maybe we don't deserve that sometimes. So sometimes this principle is one that's better inverted. Sometimes we should make the user think. Sometimes we should increase the friction within our products. Coming back, say, to this home hub, if I have sensitive information like location and heart rate, maybe I need an interface that actually defies what we call good usability and says, well, I'm going to make you write the damn words, I agree, so that you understand just how important this request is and the risk of re-identification of data in future. We also have an opportunity to draw upon a bit of ethical theory as well. One mistake I see so frequently in the tech world is we believe we're the first on any new shore. We think we have to solve things from first principles, but of course, there are millennia of ethical studies and principles. And it's time that we started paying attention to some of these, perhaps. The idea of the veil of ignorance comes from a recent philosopher called John Rawls, who wrote a book called A Theory of Justice. And Rawls says that we should design a fair system, or a fair system is one designed as if it's designed from beneath this veil of ignorance. Essentially where we don't know where we end up. We don't know our final place within that system. So let's say if I'm designing a welfare system, then a fair welfare system will be one that, were I a taxpayer, a benefit recipient, or an administrator, whatever cards I get dealt, I think I've got a roughly fair end of the deal. It's essentially agreeing the rules of the game before you decide who's playing as which character. But it's perhaps the role of critique in the design process that makes for the easiest entry points for the ethical discussion. Critique is all about asking difficult questions about the things that we're making, so it makes sense that ethics often comes to the fore here. One way you can do that is to look at, or to appoint, what we sometimes call a designated dissenter. This is an idea that comes from Eric Meyer and Sarah Wachter-Becher, and they wrote a book called Design for Real Life, talking about this. And this is really a constructive antagonist in the design process. It's someone whose job it is to lob in the occasional grenade of defiance, to subvert the decisions that the team may have chosen carelessly. So if you're asking, say, for marital status in a web form, then the designated dissenter might role play as someone saying, well, I'm going through a messy divorce. Like, why are you asking me this stuff? I resent you doing that. Now, of course, that's a role you want to rotate, right? You don't want to have one person being the designated dissenter for a year. But switching that around, I think, could be a healthy way to promote that discussion within your team. But again, coming back to the ethical theory, there's an opportunity here to ask some key and very important universal ethical questions. So I've tried to distill those down to what I call 4 ethical tests, based on the 3 main pillars of contemporary ethics. The first one is, what if everyone did what I'm about to do? Would a world in which this action was a universal law of behavior, would that be a better place or a worse place? This comes from Immanuel Kant. It's what's known as a deontological theory of ethics. It's focused very much on duty. What's our moral obligation in any particular perspective? So let's say we ask this question in the world of dark patterns. If I have a product manager sorry to throw product managers under a bus, but it's probably a product manager, asking me to ship a dark pattern, say an auto-renew field that's on when perhaps it should be off. Well, what if everyone did what I'm about to do? Well, the answer there is pretty clear, right? The world of technology would be worse. We wouldn't trust our technologies if they were full of every single dark pattern that we could possibly think of. So that gives me some ammunition to turn around and say, I'm sorry, I don't think that's actually a viable ethical decision. A second question we can ask at this phase also comes from Kant. Am I treating people as ends or as means? This maybe takes a little bit of unpacking. For me, when we talk about design, this is about mostly users. Am I seeing them as people for me to achieve my own goals? Or am I seeing them as autonomous and free ends in their own right, with their own goals perhaps more important than mine? Now, I don't think individually any of us will struggle with this question. None of us wants to be seen to use people. But I think it's a question that in large data-driven organizations, the question gets a bit harder to answer. Because I've seen what happens in some of these companies. The way we talk about users starts to shift slowly over time. They become not the reason that we're here, but they become experimental subjects, means for us to hit our targets, our OKRs. Essentially, people become masses. And whenever people become masses, unethical consequences pretty often happen. The third ethical test that we can draw upon is what's known as a utilitarian perspective on ethics. Am I maximizing happiness for the greatest number of people? And by extension, am I minimizing suffering for as many people as I can? As I say, this is a utilitarian view on ethics. It's also known as a consequentialist view because it focuses on consequences. So these folks aren't so interested in moral duty and obligation as much as they are, well, what's the actual effect of this? What's the impact? And I think the tech industry tends to lean this way because this feels a bit measurable, right? There are people who are looking into what they believe to be a valid way of assessing scientific morality, throwing people in MRI machines to understand how their brain lights up, doing the skin response thing. I think it's nonsense, to be honest, but you can see why there's at least an appeal, because if we can find some answers there, we can start to quantify what becomes the best moral approach in any situation. A fourth ethical test that I'll offer is based on the third main pillar of modern ethics. It's called virtue ethics. And the question is this: would I be happy for this to be a front page story? Would I be happy for this decision to be sent maybe as a push notification to all my friends and family? Virtue ethicists aren't so interested in duty or indeed the outcomes. They care about the moral character of the individual. How have we chosen to live? What are the values and the virtues that drive us? And are we actually showing those? Are we evidencing them through the decisions that we take? So this is really about accountability, right? Would I be happy to sign my name to a particular decision? So it speaks to our identity as individuals, and that's really an important center of ethical reasoning. Of course, when we get towards ostensibly the end of the design process, we have an opportunity to test our assumptions. Were they correct? Have these impacts been as positive as we hope? We can apply things like fairness forensics. This is Kate Crawford's term for statistical techniques to understand latent bias within our systems and our algorithms. But that has to be backed with qualitative approaches as well. We have to conduct deep field research with potentially quite vulnerable groups to understand the potential impacts of our technologies. Unfortunately, because technologies and humans operate together, the harms of technology probably most often fall on societies most vulnerable already. So we have to ally with these people. We have to listen to them and understand their contexts, because who better, of course, to act as a designated dissenter than someone who has every reason to dissent? And then underpinning all of this, we have to create what I would call ethical infrastructure, building up our resilience and our capabilities within an organization to handle these challenges. Diversity is a particularly important part of this. I see diversity as almost an early warning system for ethics. If you have a group of individuals of different backgrounds and different perspectives, they're more likely to be able to flag up if you're heading in the wrong direction at an early stage. If you're lucky enough to be a leader within your company, your team, you have the opportunity to create expectations and rewards and incentives about behaviors and the results that you're looking for. Making it clear that ethics is everyone's responsibility, putting it, say, in your career ladders, putting it in promotion and hiring decisions, that sort of thing. And then creating perhaps core values, which sometimes get a bad reputation, I think, but I've seen them be powerful ethical tiebreakers. When you have a set of core values that the whole company truly believes in, they become these reference points you can use to unpick tricky moral challenges. Now, sometimes this takes us into the realm of politics, of course. Tech companies, tech workers, they're finally seeing the power of collective action. Project Maven, the Google walkouts, and so on. You can't always choose a particular way to act ethically and then just live that way. You have to affect broader society. So we mustn't forget the power that we hold as workers, but also consumers and voters as well. The tech industry is now increasingly being targeted by both wings, so it's likely that pressure is going to grow and regulation is going to follow at some point. I think we have a duty to get involved in that process, to actually help shape good regulation, because no one, not even the most pedantic bureaucrat, wants bad regulation. We have a duty, therefore, to try and make it the best we can. But ultimately, change, ethical change, comes through practice rather than theory. Morality is a muscle that needs exercise. The choice to live well is just that. It's a choice. It's not some abstract gift that's given to some and not others. So we have to start asking ourselves difficult questions. How might I be screwing up right now in the work that I'm doing? If I think back to those ethical tests, which ones of those feel the most valid to me? What's my preferred ethical lens, if you like, and how could I learn more about it? What would my limit be? Where would I have to say, you know what, this is a line I'm not prepared to cross? And how would I start to have that conversation with my manager, with my peers? Ultimately, I think a lot of ethics is really about, if it's safe to do so, increasing the risk that we all take as individuals. Cass Sunstein, who many of you will know of as one of the two guys behind the popularization of nudge theory, coined this phrase of a norm entrepreneur, someone who stands up and challenges norms and expectations and says, actually, I think we've got to start changing our approach. Now, that is a privileged position. We have to be aware, of course, that not everyone is able to stand up in that way. It takes a certain amount it takes certain needs and circumstances to be able to do that. But I would say if you feel comfortable and safe and respected in your team and your industry, then you're in the perfect position to use up just a little bit of that goodwill to stand up for what you believe to be morally right. Now, that can be difficult, emotionally draining work. I can tell you from experience that focusing on ethics makes it very easy to punish yourself for your own mistakes and the ethical inconsistencies in your life. But there's good news with this as well. Choosing to take these decisions seriously, I think, also helps bring you closer to the person that you want to be. But really, to effect this kind of change, we have to draw upon each other. Given how tough this journey is and the challenges ahead of us in the future, we're going to need all the thoughtful technologists we can get, people who care enough to make a difference in this crucial industry and want to help navigate us toward better futures. And of course, it goes without saying that I dearly hope that you will be one of those people. So I have written a book, Future Ethics. I have just a couple of copies with me if anyone's interested in buying one afterwards. But plug over, and thank you for your time.
We don't have a lot of time for questions, but I want to ask one, and maybe if somebody else wants to think of the question now, and I'll come back to you. You've been working as a designer yourself for a long time as well. So can you name your worst design decision from a moral point of view? And was there something you did that in retrospect you think like, this was a mistake? This had an ethical implication that I either didn't foresee or didn't care enough about? It's a terrible question, I know.
I'm trying to think what I can say under what NDAs may still be extant.
Okay, you don't have to name the company.
I can go into it a little, maybe. It was when I was at Twitter, but we partnered with an organization that Twitter has some quite close links with, to mine Twitter for implied data, essentially, about behaviors, some of which may be newsworthy, some of which may be relevant to authorities. And I failed to fully consider the implication on the latter half.
Okay.
Because frankly, it didn't come up. A lot of these things often get, ethical harms often get brushed under the carpet and clouded by innovation. Oh, you're doing something exciting and new, and you can sell that
Hasn't
idea.
been done before.
Yeah,
so
this is a great
that's
challenge.
Good. Yeah.
But let's say you're working on a system that helps to target people without access to their GPS. That might be great for finding people stuck in an avalanche, but it might also be great for pinpointing drone targets.
Yeah.
And until you ask, well, who's the client and what are the potential use cases, then you often won't understand those harms. So I failed to interrogate that properly. So that
and once you realized it was too late.
Absolutely right.
Yeah,
I realized
gone.
pretty much when I'd left the company.
Yeah. Okay. One or two other questions before we have good news for you. Yes, Marcel, here, shout.
Hey.
Kenneth, I really enjoyed...
Even better, yeah.
I really enjoyed our conversation that we had earlier this afternoon. And something I'm still kind of resolving in my head and probably also in yours, and maybe we can have another stab at this with the broader audience behind us. I was wondering, what if you are a designer or an engineer currently employed at a tech company, or at least a company employing technology, and you witness that you are being, part of the creation of something that you cannot get behind. How do we help? So what can I do being that person, or how can we help that person kind of, turn the ship, or what actions to take?
Disobedience is ultimately the root of this. At some point, if the harm is severe enough, if you're a deontologist, you would say there's a moral duty to say, I will not do this, right? But disobedience doesn't have to be, complete arms folded obstructiveness. There are ways to be more constructive about disobedience in terms of trying to reframe the discussion, saying, okay, here's the goal. However, my concerns with the strategy we're taking are this, whatever potential harms might result. Are there ways that we can use ethics as a constraint, as I was saying?
I have the awful feeling that would be, PR-wise, this would be terrible to do. That would be...
Sadly, that might be one way to talk about that harm, but there should be, other reasons,
should be bigger,
of course. But, we can use that and say, how might we do this while being more ethical by design, essentially, almost like a privacy by design mindset, but saying ethics more generally. How could that spark innovation? But that person also, I think, needs to find moral allies to do that, because it's risky to do that as an individual. However appealing it sometimes and necessary it is from a moral point of view, you might get fired. I mean, that, literally that is the main risk. What we're seeing now at Google is very interesting for me, because it allows people to stand up for what they think is correct, but reduces the risk by sharing it across 1,000 people.
Yeah.
So there's something powerful about finding moral allies where you can make a stronger case, I suppose.
And there's one question here, and then we actually have to wrap up. So go ahead.
Hi, thank you for your talk. My question is about the ethical theoretical points you discussed, and I was wondering to what extent are we. Is it okay to mix and match ethical theories? Because when you consider especially the ontological ethics and utilitarian ethics, they might give you completely different standpoints and things to do. Yeah. So what shall we do? And by mixing and matching, are we actually washing down the ethical stance that we have?
I think the only people who don't mix and match their ethical theories is ethicists. Right, they tend to come down as like, I'm a deontologist, well, I'm a virtue ethicist, and they have these, holy wars about it. In reality, the layperson or someone who isn't trained, I'm not a proper ethicist. I'm a designer who's read some ethics, right? We all fit between those frames of reference, whether we know they exist or not. We might justify, the trolley problem, all this nonsense that's spoken about the trolley problem. Big study that MIT did found that essentially we apply utilitarian logic to that. We don't even know what it is, but that's naturally what we do. But we also would say, well, stealing is wrong, right? I don't steal because stealing is bad. Well, that's a deontological perspective. So we know these things sort of intuitively. I think it's okay to flip between them. But the more you get into it, eventually you'll find one convinces you more than the other. So this is where it gets tricky, is you start to have, you put forward a deontological argument and then you get a utilitarian argument back. But once you provide people with this scaffold, this structure, I think lines start to get drawn eventually. And for me, ethics is about the discourse. It's often that discussion, the airing of the issues and the talking about ethics as a way to reframe the problem is actually what causes the solution, rather than a checklist or something like that. So for me, these inform the debate, and that's where the good decisions come from. But yes, you're right, this is one of the challenges with ethics, is we still don't agree on what the right way to live is. Unfortunately, we've got to start making those calls in practice, so that's where we just have to get into that debate. Yeah.
I think there's so much more to discuss. I mean, even the fact that you assume that people want to be good, and then I read all the Facebook files, and I realize, people want to be worse and worse and worse. I could have never imagined.
They had the best intentions, I would say.
Maybe not for the world, but for themselves. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Cheers.